Story 1. My brother and I were inseparable at 10 and 12, spending nearly every day exploring the woods near our house. Those woods were our playground, our escape, our sanctuary. We knew them like the back of our hands. Every trail, every tree, every twist of the creek that snaked through them. So when my family decided to go on a hike through the cemetery and into the woods, it was just another day for us. Nothing unusual, or so we thought. We had reached our usual spot by the creek, the midway point of the trail. My older brother and I asked our parents if we could explore further upstream. They agreed as long as we didn't wander too far. That was when we found it. About 10 minutes upstream, we stumbled upon a massive hill we had never seen before. It rose steeply out of the earth, an alien feature in a landscape we thought we knew by heart. But what struck us wasn't just its size, it was what covered it. Scattered across the slope were piles of possessions, as though someone had taken the contents of a house, dumped them there, and left. Broken chairs, faded toys, ripped clothing, old books. It was all there, a chaotic graveyard of forgotten things. Painted X's marked many of the surrounding trees, stark red slashes that felt hostile and deliberate. We climbed the slope cautiously, stepping over items that felt out of place in the woods. A tattered suitcase lay half open, spilling yellowed papers and torn fabric onto the ground. Nearby, a wooden crib sat on its side, its bars splintered and chewed by time. A rusted typewriter sat upright in the dirt, its keys jammed with clumps of mud and leaves. The sheer variety of items was overwhelming, as if generations of belongings had somehow ended up here, abandoned and forgotten. I stopped to inspect a table clock with its glass face shattered. The hands were stuck at 3:17, but when I tilted it slightly, the mechanism inside let out a soft, broken tick. My brother picked up a small, leather-bound book. Its pages were warped, but he managed to flip through a few before muttering, "There's nothing in here." The words, if there had ever been any, had long since faded into the paper. The deeper we went, the stranger the items became. A long chain of keys hung from a tree branch, swaying gently in a breeze we couldn't feel. Beneath it, a porcelain clown doll sat propped against a rock, its painted grin smeared and peeling. Its eyes seemed to follow us as we moved, though we tried to ignore it. Further up, a massive wardrobe lay on its side, its doors wrenched open to reveal neatly folded clothes covered in a thick layer of dust. I felt a growing unease as we explored. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my mouth dry. There were no animal sounds, no rustling leaves or chirping birds, just the faint creak of the objects as they shifted in the wind. My brother called me over to a spot near the top of the hill, where a pile of mismatched shoes had been arranged in a rough circle. They were all sizes: baby shoes, sneakers, work boots, even a single high-heeled shoe with the heel snapped off. "Who do you think put these here?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't answer. The sight made my stomach turn, though I couldn't explain why. We noticed the red X's on the trees more as we moved uphill. Some were faint, as if they had been painted long ago, while others were so fresh the paint glistened in the dim light filtering through the trees. One particularly large tree had 4 X's painted on its trunk, overlapping each other like someone had been desperate to make the mark. I ran my fingers over the bark, feeling the thick, sticky residue of the paint. Then we heard it, our mom's voice faint but distinct, calling our names from somewhere down the creek. We glanced at each other and dropped what we were holding. We didn't want to get in trouble for wandering too far, so we started heading back down the hill. The descent was eerily quiet. The objects around us seemed to shift slightly as we moved, though we never saw anything actually move. I glanced over my shoulder once and thought I saw the clown doll sitting in a different spot than before, but my brother urged me to keep walking. The unease had grown into a dull panic, and I could tell he felt it too. By the time we reached the creek, the sound of our mom's voice was clearer, angrier. She was yelling, though we couldn't make out the words yet. We emerged from the trees to find her standing on the trail, her face a mix of fury and relief. That was when we realized just how long we had been gone. According to our mom, we had disappeared for nearly 4 hours. She and our father had been combing the woods with our younger brother, screaming our names, retracing every possible path we could have taken. Yet they never saw us, not even a trace. We tried to plead our case, swearing we hadn't gone far and explaining about the hill. My mom was having none of it. After a tongue lashing and a promise of grounded days ahead, we decided to show her. We knew exactly where it was. Just a quick turn off the creek trail, but it wasn't there. We retraced our steps over and over again, but the hill was gone. Completely. There was no slope, no discarded furniture, no painted trees. Just an uninterrupted line of woods that seemed to mock us with their normalcy. My mom thought we were lying, making up some elaborate story to cover for wandering too far. We couldn't convince her otherwise. For years, my brother and I searched for that hill. Every time we went back to those woods, we would stray off the path, scouring every possible direction. We mapped out the area as we got older, meticulously covering miles of terrain. But we never found it again. The hill, the strange possessions, the painted X's, they were just gone. Story 2. Many years ago, 2 of my best friends and I decided to spend the day mountain biking at Snowshoe in southern West Virginia. This was long before GPS became a standard feature in every car or phone, so we were relying on a mix of hastily written directions and an old map. Somewhere along the way, we got very lost. We eventually stumbled upon a tiny, forgotten town. It wasn't on the map, but we figured we'd stop and ask for directions. That's when things started feeling off. The town was completely deserted, not a single soul in sight. It wasn't late either, probably 9 or 10 in the morning. Everything about the place felt wrong, like the air was too still, the streets too quiet. We parked the truck and split up to look for anyone who could help. The first place we checked was the post office. The door was unlocked, but it was completely empty. Dust motes hung in the air, and there wasn't even a sound of a ticking clock or a hum from the lights. We moved on to the bar, the only one in town. It was unlocked, music playing softly from a jukebox in the corner, but no bartender, no customers, no one. The faint smell of stale beer lingered in the air, as if the place had been busy just hours earlier, but there was no sign of life. We kept searching, moving from one business to another, peering into windows, walking down the empty streets. We didn't see so much as a stray cat. The whole town was silent, like it had been abandoned mid-sentence. After 20 or 30 minutes of searching, we finally spotted someone. A single old man walking alone in the middle of the street. The 3 of us practically ran up to him, all talking at once. The first thing we asked wasn't even for directions. It was, "Where is everyone?" The man just stared at us like we were the strange ones. After a moment, he shrugged and said, "Well, I guess folks around here don't get up much till around noon." His tone was casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Trying to shake off the unease, we asked him for directions to Snowshoe. He pointed back toward the road we'd come in on and told us to follow it about 10 miles before making a right to find the interstate. He didn't say much else, and we didn't stick around to chat. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. We thanked him quickly and headed back to the truck. As we left, the feeling of unease followed us. The empty streets, the unlocked but deserted buildings, the old man who seemed to appear out of nowhere. It all felt wrong, though none of us could quite put it into words. 5 miles down the road, things got even stranger. We came across a woman standing in the middle of the road. She was dressed in a state road uniform, holding a stop slow sign. The road ahead was a long, straight stretch, and there wasn't a single car in sight. As we pulled up, she turned the sign from slow to stop, motioning for us to wait. We rolled down the window and asked what was going on. She explained that there was road construction up ahead. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, though there wasn't any visible sign of work being done. We told her about the strange experience we just had in the town. She laughed and said, "Yeah, folks from there are kind of strange, but I wouldn't worry too much about it." Her laughter was oddly dismissive, like she knew something we didn't but wasn't going to share. The conversation drifted, and we ended up talking with her for 45 minutes, maybe an hour. She seemed friendly enough, but in hindsight, something about her felt off. We didn't see a single vehicle approach from either direction the entire time we were stopped. No cars from behind us, no oncoming traffic, nothing. Just her, standing there in the middle of a deserted road. Eventually she said, "Well, I guess it's clear now. Y'all can go ahead." She slowly turned the sign from stop to slow and waved us forward. We thanked her and drove on, assuming we'd soon pass whatever road crew she'd been directing. But for the next 30 miles, there was nothing. No cones, no signs, no workers, no equipment, just an empty stretch of road cutting through the forest. The further we drove, the more unsettled we became. How had she gotten there? There was no vehicle parked nearby, no indication of how she had arrived or how she planned to leave. We realized too late that we hadn't seen a single car since we left the town. After 30 miles, we finally found the turn for the interstate and headed north, abandoning our plans for the day. None of us spoke much on the drive home, but the experience weighed heavily on all of us. Months later, at a friend's wedding, the memory came up again. "Do you remember that town?" I asked. My friend's face went pale, and he nodded. "Every detail," he said quietly. "It still freaks me out." Story 3. This happened when I was 13. No one in my family will acknowledge it, and the only ones who ever entertained my pleas for explanation, my great-grandparents, have since passed away. Anytime I try to bring it up now, I'm met with silence or rolled eyes. My family owns a cabin in Cook's Forest, Clarion, Pennsylvania. Built by my great-granddad, it has a rustic charm that has been maintained through the years. It sits at the bottom of a long dirt road, tucked into a little nook surrounded by trees. A few other properties are scattered nearby, but most are further up the hill along the road. Only one was close to us, a partially visible lot halfway down the hill that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The lot contained the remains of a crumbling cabin built into the hillside, with a concrete basement exposed on one side. It was familiar, almost comforting in its stillness. We passed it often, whether riding ATVs or walking down the trail. That familiarity changed one Memorial Day weekend. It was a family tradition to gather at the cabin every year to open it up after winter. I woke up the first morning expecting to hear the chatter of adults downstairs and the smell of my great-granddad's famous dinosaur-shaped pancakes wafting upstairs. Instead, I woke to silence. I thought maybe I'd woken up too early, but when I got downstairs, it was immediately clear that something was off. The adults were outside in a semicircle, talking to a man and a woman I didn't recognize. The couple looked polished, standing out against the rustic setting. I assumed it was some adult business and went to wake my cousins. On my way back upstairs, I glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was 3 p.m. That didn't make sense. I was always too excited to sleep late at the cabin, and 3 p.m. was absurd. But there it was. I woke my cousins and waited for the adults to come back inside. Eventually, the kitchen came alive with activity as my great-granddad fired up the stove to make pancakes, and the tension seemed to ease. But when I asked my aunt, my cool aunt, who was usually all smiles, what was wrong, she was pale and nervous. She took me outside and pointed to the abandoned lot halfway down the hill. Except it wasn't abandoned anymore. In its place stood a sprawling cabin mansion, gleaming and out of place in the quiet forest. The parking area was filled with shiny SUVs, and the coolest four-wheelers I had ever seen were parked out front. My aunt explained that the couple I saw earlier were the new owners, and they had invited us to come over and meet their nieces and nephews, who were also visiting for the weekend. I was thrilled at the thought of riding those four-wheelers and nearly sprinted toward the mansion, but my aunt caught my arm and reminded me about my great-granddad's pancakes. Reluctantly, I went back inside. The adults acted like everything was normal, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. I asked my aunt why we couldn't go, and she looked me dead in the eye and asked, "Did you see that cabin last year or last month? Did you see any construction?" She was right. There had been no sign of activity on that lot. I had spent years at the cabin, riding past that abandoned property, and it had always been the same, crumbling, empty, lifeless. My aunt's words were enough to make me pause, but I still didn't understand the tension. The owners seemed polite enough. That night, the unease became impossible to ignore. My great-granddad, a World War II veteran who rarely showed fear, was loading shotguns. He handed one to my grampy and another to my uncle. My normally gentle grandmother quietly pulled a pistol out of her purse and kept it within reach. When I asked why they were arming themselves, I was met with non-answers and a quick reassurance to stay inside the cabin. I remember lying in bed that night, wide awake, imagining my little grandma fending off intruders with her glittery Glock. The next morning, I woke to the familiar smell of pancakes and the sound of adults chatting in the kitchen. Relieved that things seemed back to normal, I ran downstairs only to be hit with another wave of confusion. The microwave clock read 7:30 a.m., but my aunt insisted that it was Saturday morning. I froze. Yesterday had been Saturday. I had woken up at 3 p.m. to a day that felt off-kilter, only for everything to reset as if it had never happened. I ran outside to confirm what I already suspected. The abandoned lot was back to its usual decrepit state. The mansion was gone, as were the SUVs and the four-wheelers. I tried to ask my aunt about it again, but her dismissive tone shut me down. "You must have had a weird dream," she said, though her expression betrayed her discomfort. I pushed the strangeness out of my mind and spent the rest of the weekend riding ATVs and hanging out with my cousins. By the time we left, I had convinced myself that it was just some weird misunderstanding or coincidence. That is, until I went back to school. I was called to the office to explain why I hadn't been at school on Monday. Confused, I told them it was Monday. They corrected me. It was Tuesday, and I had missed the previous day without explanation. Calls had been made to both of my parents, but neither of them had been at the cabin. No one in my family will talk about what happened, even now. The abandoned lot remains unchanged, and I am not allowed to go near it or talk about it. Story 4. It happened years ago, but I still remember it clearly. I was driving through rural New England, somewhere near the borders of Vermont and Massachusetts, though I couldn't say which state I was in. It was late. Well, so late it was technically early, and the fog, thick, impenetrable fog, had rolled in, blanketing everything in an eerie, suffocating gray. Like the kind of idiot who dies in the opening scene of a horror movie, I had decided to take back roads. The main highway had felt too long and monotonous, and I figured the scenic route would keep me awake. Big mistake. The first sign that something wasn't right came when my passenger side headlight went out without warning. I cursed under my breath, realizing the remaining light wasn't enough to cut through the fog. High beams were useless, scattering the light into a blinding white wall. I had to crawl along at barely 15 miles per hour, squinting into the dense gray. I hadn't passed a house, a gas station, or even another car in what felt like hours. Then the engine started making an odd noise, a strained metallic whine. Almost immediately, the check engine light blinked on. My stomach sank. I pulled over onto the shoulder, though shoulder was generous. The road was barely wide enough for two cars, and on either side was nothing but fog and darkness. I got out of the car, and the silence was unnerving. No wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the fog as I opened the hood and peered at the engine. I'm decent with electronics, but I don't know a damn thing about fixing cars. I tightened what I could and checked the few things I actually recognized. When I got back in and turned the key, the car gave a sad sputter before falling silent. It was dead. And of course, my cell phone had no service, not even a single bar. I leaned back in the driver's seat and laughed bitterly. Everything about the situation felt like a setup for some low-budget horror movie. Dense fog, a dead car, no cell service, and no sign of life for miles. The cliches were piling up. I wasn't about to go wandering off into the fog like some B-movie victim, so I decided to wait it out. I reclined my seat, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and resolved to take a nap until sunrise. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to burn away the fog. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and immediately froze. I wasn't parked on the side of a desolate road anymore. Instead, I was in the middle of what looked like the main street of a small town. Neatly kept houses lined both sides of the road, their shutters closed and curtains drawn tight. A large Victorian-style house sat directly across from me, its gabled roof and peeling paint giving it an unsettling resemblance to the Bates Motel house. The fog clung stubbornly to the ground, curling around the base of lampposts and the wheels of my car. I stared in disbelief. I had been certain I was in the middle of nowhere. There hadn't been a single light on during the night. No sign of civilization at all. Where had this town come from? I stepped out of the car and looked around. Everything was eerily still. No birds chirping, no hum of air conditioners, not even the faint creak of a weathered porch swing. It was like the town was holding its breath. About 50 yards down the road, I spotted a small service station with an old-fashioned gas pump out front. Relieved, I made my way over. The man behind the counter looked perfectly normal. Graying hair, grease-stained overalls, a friendly enough smile. I explained my situation, and he nodded as if this sort of thing happened all the time. He followed me back to the car. I told him everything. The dead engine, the headlight that had gone out. But when he asked me to try starting it, the car roared to life on the first turn of the key. Both headlights were working perfectly. The mechanic shrugged and said, "Must have just been the cold." I didn't argue. I thanked him, got back in the car, and drove away as quickly as I could without looking back. The weirdest part? I never got the name of the town. I tried finding it on a map later, retracing my route as best I could, but it was like the place didn't exist. It always made me feel like I had been dropped into the beginning of a horror movie, only for the plot to lose interest and move on. Story 5. A group of friends and I decided to take a small Saturday afternoon road trip into the backcountry of South Carolina. We wanted to find some antique shops, cemeteries, abandoned buildings, anything that might make for an interesting adventure. It was the kind of aimless trip we all loved, just seeing where the road would take us. Around noon, we piled into my car and started driving southwest. The day started uneventfully, just some light conversation and stretches of southern pine forests lining the highway. We passed a few horse farms and some quaint old mill towns, but nothing interesting enough to stop for. A few gas stations and rundown general stores came and went, and by the time 2 p.m. rolled around, we were all getting hungry. Our group had an unspoken rule for road trips: always try to eat at local diners or mom-and-pop places. Chains were out of the question. We kept driving until we saw a faded green road sign pointing toward a town 5 miles ahead. It sounded perfect. The road leading into the town was narrow and cracked, with weeds sprouting in the center line. As we drove in, the atmosphere shifted. There were no other cars, no people walking around, and no houses. Instead, the streets were lined with crumbling warehouses and abandoned shops. Most of the windows were broken, and the few cars we did see looked like they had been sitting there since the 1990s, their paint chipped and their tires flat. The further we drove, the worse it got. Finally, we spotted a diner at the end of the main street. It was a squat little building with a few cars in the parking lot and a flickering open sign in the window. Through the glass, we could see about 10 people seated at tables inside. It seemed like a lucky find, so we parked and went in. The moment we stepped through the door, the energy in the room shifted. Every single person in the diner stopped what they were doing and stared at us. It was the kind of scene you see in a movie where the jukebox screeches to a halt, except this was far more unsettling. In the middle of the diner, a large table of 6 people turned to look at us before hurriedly whispering among themselves. A nervous-looking waitress shuffled toward us, her movements stiff. She couldn't have been more than 16. "How many?" she asked quietly, barely making eye contact. "4, my friend Chris said in a normal tone of voice. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned again, and the waitress recoiled slightly as if startled. She quickly led us to a 4-top near the large table in the middle of the room and scurried away to get our drink orders. The silence was palpable. As soon as she left, we all leaned in and whispered about how strange the place felt. The line cook, standing behind the counter, was openly glaring at us with a look of pure hostility. He was a burly man with a grizzled beard, and his eyes tracked every move we made. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress came back, took our orders, and hurried off again, leaving us alone in the dining room with the large family at the other table. With nothing else to do, we started studying them. At first glance, they seemed like your average Southern family. There was a haggard-looking woman with stringy hair and a tired expression, a man in grease-stained coveralls with sun-leathered skin, and 3 little girls in Sunday dresses. But the last person at the table was different. It was another woman, dressed in the same style as the little girls. A red paisley dress with frilled lace at the collar and cuffs. She was in her 40s with long, unkempt hair that mostly obscured her face. Beside her was a doll seated in a high chair. At first, we thought it was just a quirky decoration or a toy for the youngest girl, but it quickly became clear that the doll was hers. The woman would lean toward the doll, whisper something, and then giggle softly. Her hands moved with strange precision as she adjusted the doll's dress and smoothed its hair. Our waitress brought their food out first. She set plates down in front of everyone, including the doll. "Here you go, sweetie," she said to the doll, speaking in a high-pitched babyish voice. We watched in stunned silence as the woman lifted the doll from the high chair, cradled it in her arms, and answered in a voice that didn't seem like her own. It was high-pitched and girlish, completely unlike the low, gravelly whispers she had been using before. She was speaking for the doll. "Thank you, Miss Mary," she said, giggling again. Chris muttered something under his breath, and my other friend shot him a sharp look, silently warning him not to draw attention. The waitress eventually brought our food, mediocre burgers and fries, and left without a word. We ate quickly, the oppressive tension making every bite feel like a chore. The doll's owner continued to talk for the doll in her unsettling child's voice, responding to the family's comments as if the doll were part of the conversation. We couldn't finish fast enough. Chris dropped $40 on the table, and we got up to leave. As we pushed open the door, I glanced back. The family was still sitting at their table, but the woman with the doll had turned her head to watch us. Her gaze followed us all the way to the car. As we drove out of the town, Chris scanned every sign, desperate to find the town's name. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced we were being followed. Months later, we tried to retrace our steps to find the diner again. We wanted to see it in the daylight, to prove to ourselves that it was real. But no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't find it. The town was gone, literally erased. We all remember it vividly and joke about it time to time, but cannot make any sense of the whole experience. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.